The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head over to StarCityGames.com/sale because now until Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, we're running our supply sale. And you can save 50% off select supplies. That's sleeves, deck boxes, playmats, trade binders, and other gaming supplies. All those things that help keep your cards safe from the elements. Take advantage of this sale and protect what you collect at StarCityGames.com/sale.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more. Before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. Head over to coalesceapparel.shop and use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. If you want to rep the coolest Magic the Gathering themed hoodies and t-shirts or stickers, head over to coalesceapparel.shop. Maybe you want to rep our fallen friend Golos with the Tireless Pilgrim versus the Multiverse shirt, or maybe you're Wooburg Forever and you want to go with the South Beach collection. Any way you want to do it. Anti-Mulligan Club, we got you. MTG Jam, of course. And all of the Keeping It 100 line, there for you, coalesceapparel.shop. Use gift code SCG at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our Innistrad Crimson Vow Cube review here on the 540, your favorite Cube podcast hosted by StarCityGames.com. My name is Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. And right now I am filling the role typically filled by my regular co-host, Justin Parnell. Unfortunately, Justin does need to take some time off of the podcast for personal reasons. You can find his write-up on what's going on with him on his personal Twitter at jparnell1. We are wishing you the best, Justin, if you're listening. I hope that you are able to come back and join us very soon. In Justin's stead, we do have a special guest co-host, though. It's going to be Star City Games' own Ryan Saxe. Ryan, thank you for joining us this week.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that we're going to clear up, we're doing our Cube review here, which means we're going to be talking about new cards in the new Innistrad set. And we talk about them on the podcast in terms of classically powerful Cube cards or custom Cube cards, not to be confused with Ryan Saxe's custom Cube. If we call a card, or classic Cube rather, if we call a card classic, his custom classic Cube. See, I'm all messed up here. But if we call a card classically powerful, that does not mean that Ryan's going to be cubing with it, but it does mean that it is a card that has kind of its own merits to stand on in terms of cube inclusion. These are going to be generically powerful cards, and then we'll also be talking about cards that are a little bit more for custom designs, cards that are maybe looking for some specific synergies or support. And I'm also going to clarify, we do now have 2 Ryans on the podcast. It's so natural for me to just call you Ryan, and I'm sure that's going to be going both ways. Bear with us as we navigate these new waters. But last week, Justin and I tackled blue and white cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow. This week, we're going to black and red. Next week's going to be green and the rest. But we're going through black and red. And then we also have been doing the commander cards that we see appropriate. We had one last week, and now we do have the full preview for the commander decks as well. And there's a couple of those that are going to make our black and red lists as well. And so when we talk about our cube reviews or our personal cube preferences, over the weeks we've been doing this, we've been doing this over half a year now. Listeners have gotten kind of a feel for a lot of Justin and my own preferences. Justin's really big on black as a color in Magic. I'm, of course, a big Izzet guy going into Grixis. Where do your biases tend to fall?
It's interesting. I would say I'm very similar to sort of both of that. For me personally in Cube, black has been the most interesting puzzle. I think it's been, especially over the last, it's gotten better recently. But black sections in Cube can tend to be a little bit difficult to cater to. So I do really enjoy black, particularly black aggro. Big fan of aggressive strategies all around the board. You'll basically see me on two ends of the spectrum, either hyper aggro or some crazy convoluted combo that I'm trying to cobble together. I tend to shy away from mid-range strategies. I like it when all of my cards are very cheap, which usually ends up being, shying away from 5 mana Baneslayer, Haymakers, 4 mana Planeswalkers, a bunch of cantrips, a bunch of 1-drops, and whatever else goes with it.
Okay. Sounds like we have some similar preferences there. I tend to be the most critical of the expensive cards when I'm at least looking at a booster pack, drafting a cube. You gotta really sell me on playing a 5 mana permanent.
Yeah, they really have to earn their keep. Especially, something I've noticed with my own cubes is, over time they just become leaner and leaner and leaner. Now I think the average converted mana cost or mana value, I guess now, of my cube is much lower now than it was just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always more 1 and 2 mana things just to get you going. And that's kind of going to be a theme on our set reviews here carrying forward today. A number of the cards that we're going to put in the classic category. And to be fair, that's a pretty lean list for this set, but you're going to generally see a bias towards the cheaper cards. It's easier to put the lower mana value cards into a cube, as Ryan was saying there. That totally resonates with me. All right, but I think we're pretty well set just to jump into it. We have black and red cards on deck. I know you probably just listened to some ads. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Here's a couple more, and then we're going to jump into the black cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow for Cube.
Look, we're all Magic players here, so I know you're probably like me. And you have some extra cards that are hanging around that you would love to sell for cash or maybe trade in for some more cards. Well, if you're looking to sell or trade your Magic the Gathering cards, it has literally never been easier. Visit starcitygames.com/sell. with a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry. There is no reason to sell to anybody else. We have 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. 1, check out our buy list. You can find out exactly what we're paying for each of your cards individually right now. That too much work? Number 2, check out our ship and sell program. Put your cards in a box, tape it up, send it to us. We'll do the rest of the work. Or if you're passing through Roanoke, Virginia, come visit Star City Comics and Games, and we can sit down with a buyer and work out a trade right there in the store. Or if you might be a store and you're looking to offload bulk and you have over 500,000 cards you're looking to sell, we can come to you. Any of the ways that you want to work with us, go to starcitygames.com/sell. That's SELL. Right now for more information.
All right, welcome back. And now it is time for us to get into the black cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow for Cube considerations. We'll be starting with our list of classically powerful Cube cards. And to continue the alliteration, our first classic card is Concealing Curtains. Try saying that 5 times fast. This is a card that I actually think is incredibly cool, and I've had the opportunity to play with it a little bit. It is a 1 mana wall, so it's a 0/4 for 1 black mana with Defender. And for 2 and a black, you can transform Concealing Curtains, activate that only as a sorcery. And it transforms into Revealing Eye, which is a 3/4 eye horror with Menace. And when this creature transforms into Revealing Eye, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player discards that card, then draws a card. So in some ways, this card is reminiscent of Vendilion Clique. You have a 3-power evasive creature. Couple differences. You're doing this at sorcery speed, both the discard ability and the creature. You have to do that on your own turn at sorcery speed. But you do get a lot more toughness, and you're in the color black, which is usually very interested in these effects that can pick your opponent's hand apart. So I like this card quite a lot, and the fact that it's attached to a creature, in some ways you can make the argument that that makes the disruption and the discard effect somewhat vulnerable to removal. But I actually think that the upside of being attached to a body, if you're trying to do a sacrifice theme, and even just being attached to a 1-mana creature for like a mid-range, maybe slanted Reanimator deck, this card's going to be right at home at a lot of the powerful black decks you would see in Cube.
Yeah, I agree completely. I really, really like Concealing Curtains. It's just kind of, it's my type of card. It's a 1-mana card. It can attack, although it does come down as a defender. And hand disruption is something that I think is one of the most underrated aspects of Cube in general. I'm not shy from first picking a duress, let alone something like a Thoughtseize. So I'm a big fan of this card. I don't know if I'm going to have it in my personal cube yet. I'll probably play around with it. The one thing that I'll say is I really wish it wasn't target opponent reveals their hand. I would really like it if, like, basically, as far as my perspective on this card goes, this would be a slam dunk in my list if I could play it as a discard outlet in my Reanimator decks.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Without it, when I think about how the card can fit into my cube or other cubes like it, it can't really play a role in black aggro as much or aggressively slanting black decks because, the 1-mana 0/4 is going to be too much. And I probably wouldn't be interested in, the 4-mana side. You can always play this as, 2 black, 3/4 menace with that enters the battlefield effect. As is, I like the card a lot. But I think it's going to end up sort of at a lower power level where you're more interested in tangoing in combat, if that makes sense. Still classic, but maybe not vintage Cube, if that makes sense.
I think it does depend the nature, the makeup of your specific vintage Cube. Something that we've talked about a little bit, and I tend to write about when I do the breakdowns for the Magic Online vintage Cube, is that there's really kind of a lack of support for a next best strategy. Reanimator is very well supported. You have some stuff for control, some stuff for storm. There's not really an aggressive deck, and it's a 540 card cube. And just the back half of the black cards, they really leave something to be desired. And I think that even if they did go down the supporting sacrifice as a direction that I think would be good for that cube, this card can kind of hack it just by being a cheap body there. As it stands, I think that this, more than a lot of the mid-range cards, I would just put in my Reanimator deck.
Oh, I do agree with that. And I think this is, again, the 1-mana thing, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm willing to play this more than even in a Reanimator deck. There are like 5-mana planeswalkers, right, that can play some mid-range game and also function as really slow Reanimator spells. But I would rather have a cheap body to prevent myself from losing to aggro that can also be disruptive to make sure that my big fatty gets through. So I would never blink if I saw this in a cube list, and I think it's a great addition to a lot of cubes. I think you need to be trying to tango in combat maybe a little bit more, but also that's a good thing. I think something that I often forget to do in my own cube design is making sure that games are as engaging as possible. And this is a card that, asks you to have some sort of board presence. It gives you a board presence. It's good against opposing board presences, and it's a form of interaction. That's just good, clean Magic.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of good, clean Magic, you got a card that you're a little bit bigger on than I am.
Yeah, so Dread Fugue, if I'm saying that correctly, is a single black mana. It has Cleave. I really don't know how to read that in the context of this, but I'll do my best. So it's 1 black mana. Its target player reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it with mana value 2 or less. That player discards that card. However, its Cleave cost is 2 and a black, which would remove the with mana value 2 or less. So effectively, you can take any card if you spend 3 mana. So the reason I'm high on this is, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, the overall mana cost of cards in my cube has been trending down, intensely for the last few years, such that I'm finding more and more decks have a not just like cards at the 1 and 2 mana slot, but a density of cards at the 1 and 2 mana slot. Particularly, you never do nothing for the first few turns, right? If you go, land something, right? In cube, you're going to fall pretty far behind, particularly in the classic category. And so a 1 mana card that's capable of disrupting those initial plays while also, not being dead later. Is it as good as Inquisition? No. Is it as good as Duress? Probably also no, but I'm always in the market for 1 mana disruption.
I do agree with that positioning. I would put this card worse than Duress. I'm not sure what the general consensus is on that. I think that the worse than Inquisition point is kind of obvious. I'd be kind of surprised to see somebody go the other way on that one. And for me, that's a little bit where it breaks down. I think it's Inquisition of Kozilek. It's good that you're here to be on its side. Justin's also big, and Inquisition of Kozilek, bigger than I am. I find that, so the role of discard is you either have a small range of things that your deck cares about and you're trying to make sure that your opponent can't disrupt you, or you can be doing it as a more destructive form of interaction where you look at your opponent's hand and whatever they're bad at doing, you break that up and try to play a regular game of Magic. That's how it's going to be in more of a mid-range style of game. No matter what you're looking for, Thoughtseize gives it to you. I find that a lot of decks struggle casting Inquisition of Kozilek because the opposition will regularly have really powerful stuff that you care about at 4 or more mana. Dreadfew can hit the bigger stuff, but Coercion has... I don't think I've ever seen that in a cube, or if I haven't been happy.
Yeah,
I have less experience like casting my own Inquisition and being frustrated because I do kind of value it lower, so I just pass the card. But I have a lot of recent experience of my opponent casting Inquisition, missing, and me just cackling, which is maybe petty on my part. But I'm a little less into this card than Ryan Saxe, and I don't know. I'm probably just going to call you Ryan. It's really weird.
I think it'll end up working out. I mean, who else are we talking to?
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully people can differentiate our voices. I think that this one, I know Justin did get his card list together before we would have recorded this week. So he did have it listed custom as well, which is probably where I would put it. But you are our advocate for this being a classic card.
Yep. I don't think I'm ever really going to be casting it for the cleave cost. I think, as I said, black hand disruption is also kind of a soft spot for me. I tend to take those cards very, very highly. It's, a form of interaction I view as, about as premium as it gets. I said I'd first pick a Duress, and I think, through that lens, it may make sense as to why I see this card as classic, right?
Hmm. Yeah, that certainly translates. And then we have one more classic black card in Innistrad Crimson Vow, and it's the poster boy of the set. So, well, actually, I guess Edgar and Olivia are the poster people, but Sorin the Mirthless, he's up there. He's one of the Draculas in the Dracula crossover. There's actually a lot of cards named Dracula, which is very weird.
Really?
But anyway, yeah, there's not that many characters in the Dracula lore, as it turns out. But Sorin the Mirthless is a planeswalker for 2 black, a legendary planeswalker Sorin that starts with 4 loyalty. You can give Sorin +1 loyalty to look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card and put it in your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. So you can choose to take the coward's route and just leave it on top. You can -2 Sorin to create a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink. And then the ultimate, you can -7, and Sorin the Mirthless deals 13 damage to any target. You gain 13 life. So the big thing about this card is that black has a couple really good 3-mana planeswalkers, and it has some good 5-mana planeswalkers, even some representation in powerful 6-mana planeswalkers. This is the first 4-mana planeswalker that just does good things. They've all been really specific to this point. some calling out zombies, some kind of pushing you in a direction to be literally mono black and are still inefficient even in that role. These abilities are all just good. They are not totally game breaking. This card's not on the level of the most powerful 4-mana planeswalkers, actually in any other color. I'll say that this card is worse than not just Jason the Mind Sculptor, not worse than just Chandra Torch of Defiance. It's probably worse than Gideon and Elspeth 4, and it's certainly worse than Garruk Wildspeaker. That said, Planeswalkers are just great value cards. When it comes to playing with Planeswalkers, it is often preferable to have a bunch of them. And this is a Planeswalker that has a +1 that generates value, a minus that generates value and protects itself, and then the lifelinking token on the -2 synergizes with the +1, or the +1 building to that -7. Not only does 13 damage do a pretty good job at closing the game, but that life gain also makes up for the life loss if you get to that point. So I don't think this card is an absolute home run. However, I don't think it needs to justify its inclusion in Cube.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, but I have a few comments about, well, this card specifically. One, I hate how the +1 is a May. So much. Whatever happened to greatness at any cost? Right? Like what? There's something that feels so right about the card Dark Confidant. It's the same thing that feels so wrong about Sorin, but I'll get past that. That's okay. It's a good card. I admit that this is a good card. Wouldn't blink twice if I saw it in a cube. I do want to say, yes, it's the first, generically powerful and playable 4-mana black planeswalker. I don't think you should include a card in your cube for the reason that it is a 4-mana black planeswalker. It's not like that's a slot that you have to abide by. Absolutely good card to play. I'm probably going to be picking up a copy to try it out. But I've been hearing a lot of people say, oh, now I have a 4-mana planeswalker to play, so I have to play it. And that's not how I believe, at least, you should go about cube design. I guess I can't tell anybody what to do, right? They should do what they want to do. But a 4-mana card, a 5-mana card, a 3-mana card, there are planeswalkers and you can cast them. This is one that does something very important for black, which you alluded to as lifelink, life gain. This is something that Zach Hill kind of hammered home. I don't remember the name of the card when it was printed. I think it was from Aether Revolt. It's black for a 2/3 Death Touch lifelink.
Gifted Aetherborn.
Yeah, Gifted Aetherborn. He was very excited about that. And one of the things that he sort of pointed to with it was Dark Confidant, and all of these great black cards ask you to pay life. And so offsetting that with forms of life gain, even though, a card that can, regenerate your life, Vampire Nighthawk is an example, Gifted Aetherborn, may not be as powerful as some other cards in Cube. When you put them together with the most powerful black cards, it creates a really compelling deck at the end of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Lifelink, I think, it's one of those mechanics. It's just been part of Magic for so long, and you can kind of take for granted how good it is as you see other parts of the game ramp up. And then over time, as you get more of the tide rising, more different effects, or kind of realizing the best versions or better versions than we've seen before. Lifelink and haste are two keywords that have just risen so much, just abstractly, with how much flatter the power band has gotten in recent years. Yep.
It's also the bane of my existence in this current limited format, but that's for another podcast topic.
All right. So that is our 3 classic cards for black. So we're going to move to the custom section. These are cards that need a little bit more specific context.
Cool. So the first thing that we got here is Blood Fountain. Blood Fountain is an artifact for a single black mana. When Blood Fountain enters the battlefield, create a blood token. And it has an activate ability for 3 and a black. You can tap and sacrifice Blood Fountain to return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Not the most powerful card by any means. It's a common to note for pauper cubes. But most importantly, from my perspective, is it's 1 mana to create 2 artifacts. An artifact theme is a common theme across many different types of cube. if there's an artifact deck that cares about just having permanents on the battlefield, supporting something like a Tog strategies, and that bleeds into black, I do think this has a good home there.
For sure. And I'll also say the artifact Tubert is one of my more recent projects. And some colors offer you a lot of artifact support, even cards that generate or care about artifacts in terms of your colored spells. Black is pretty light. So there is plenty of room in black for effects like this. So I would not be surprised at all to see this in artifact cubes of really any color, any rarity restriction or not. Right. Our next custom card is going to be Blood Vial Purveyor. This is a 4-mana 5/6 vampire for 2 black with flying and trample. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player creates a blood token. Blood tokens, of course, you can pay 1 and sacrifice those artifact tokens to discard a card and then draw a card. And then whenever Blood Vial Purveyor attacks, it gets +1/+0 for each blood token defending player controls against until end of turn. This card has a day 0 errata. It was misprinted.
Oh my god,
with that,
I didn't even realize
that ability
that.
Seemingly being non-ending.
Yeah.
But it is only until end of turn. But the thing about this card, it's really big. All right, a 5/6 with flying and trample for 4, that is huge. The problem is, certainly if you're looking at a classically powerful cube, there's still plenty that trades 1-for-1 with this card. And when you give your opponent some benefit, however small it may be, how small you perceive it to be, it's going to be really serious downside. If you cast this, your opponent, for example, casts Oblivion Ring on it and gets a blood token for the trouble. And this also isn't as good as a lot of the most powerful 4 or then 5 mana options to actually close the game. This is a pretty cool card. I think that you had to either be pretty deliberately scaled back on power level or explicitly supporting vampires as a theme, or maybe doing something kind of funky with blood tokens. At that point, it is still awkward because you give your opponent the blood tokens. So then you might actually just be making the card much worse. So it's sort of card where, yeah, it's going to be in some cubes. It hits hard. There's just really serious downside if you have a lot of unconditional removal in your cube.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to play with and against this card a few times in Limited. It is worse than I thought, particularly because of the fact that the blood tokens are only 1 mana to sacrifice. So when I initially read this card, I read it as, okay, it's a big dumb idiot, but it kills them so quickly because let's say they can't remove it, they're casting spells and it's getting bigger. The thing is, they can, if they have 5 mana, cast a 4-drop, sack the blood token. It's not getting bigger. And it's not as fast of a clock. Now, I personally have a soft spot for cards like Abyssal Persecutor. I love myself a big black, dragon that's not really a dragon with a downside. This one, I think, as you sort of said, you need to be in the space where it's not necessarily, you're in a lower power band. It's not necessarily a card that takes over the game, but it ends the game quickly. But you also don't want it to be in a space probably where there's way too much removal running around to make it just feel bad when you cast it.
Yeah, something like Arena Cube is probably the home that this card's going to find.
Yeah. And is there any so yeah, you don't want, it's funny because the opponent gets the blood token. I keep thinking, okay, it enables discard synergies and artifact synergies, but it's not. It enables it for your opponent. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this one, but I'm sure, also vampires is a card type that people do love. So, having a big vampire at 4, if that's what you want, that's what you get.
For sure.
So our next card in the custom section is Cemetery Desecrator. Cemetery Desecrator is a 6-drop. It costs 4 black. It is a zombie, which is a card type that matters. Has menace. When Cemetery Desecrator enters the battlefield or dies, exile another card from a graveyard. When you do, choose 1. You can either remove X counters from target permanent, where X is the mana value of the exiled card, or target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is the mana value of the exiled card, and it is a 4/4. So this is, what was the card called? Noxious Gearhulk, right? Like a 6 mana, somewhat evasive, right? I think that had menace as well. Creature that kills another creature. This is going to give -X probably as the most common mode when it enters the battlefield or dies. The only thing that makes this a little iffy to me, right, is it's equal to the mana value of a card that was exiled from a graveyard. And so, at what number really does this -X get me excited for custom in some space? Maybe if I care a lot about death triggers or zombies or something of that sort. Because I think at -3/3, it's going to be a hard sell. But when you get to -4/4, -5/5, then maybe we're talking. But how often is that necessarily going to happen?
There's some cheeky stuff you can do. You can put Street Wraith and like Striped Riverwinder, just cheap cyclers in your cube, and maybe there's some other ways to exploit that. But yeah, this card, I think it's mostly leaning on being a zombie. It does have the problem that most 6 mana cards have. Certainly for 6 mana black cards, it's not Grave Titan, so the space gets crowded very quickly. But yeah, it's kind of a cool thing you can set up with the graveyard. I imagine this would be a card for a cube that's trying to more closely emulate a retail limited environment, and this is a card that can be a quite good rare, but it's a very beatable rare.
Right. That's a really good point too. Just so I understand, can it exile itself when it? Oh, exile another card. Okay, never mind. I thought
you unfortunately can't sacrifice it and just give something
does it at least
-6.
Guarantee being able to do the -6 part. That makes
play
sense.
it real safe with that one, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that's a kind of cube that I haven't drafted so much, but I've always thought about building. So thinking, and I know someone who has like a cube that's meant to be kind of like Chaos Draft, where there are rare mythic level things that are kind of dispersed like crazy, and this could be potentially a good home for that kind of format. I can see it for sure.
Definitely. Our next card is Desperate Farmer, 2 and a black for a 2/2 human peasant with lifelink. When another creature you control dies, transform Desperate Farmer into Depraved Harvester, a 4/3 human knight with lifelink. So this is a common. The space for a sacrifice deck is really crowded at 3. Honestly, the space for a lot of archetypes across all cubes gets really crowded at 3. But for a sacrifice theme, for a pauper cube, certainly one that has an emphasis on combat mattering, having this thing that cares about die triggers that turns into a giant lifelinker can definitely give your opponent something to really think about in combat.
Yeah. It's an interesting card that it's odd for like a 3 mana 2/2 to have a strong impact on the battlefield when you play it, but this one certainly does. And I mean, I'm not a huge fan of playing against 4/3 lifelinkers, but I guess that's more of a nod towards the card than against it for something like a pauper cube.
Right.
So our next card is Dying to Serve. Just 2 and a black for an enchantment. It says whenever you discard 1 or more cards, create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. My favorite line of text. So many cards. I get so excited when reading them, right? Like I'm going, oh yeah, this is great. And you keep going and you think it's always the last line. It's always the last sentence. So you get so excited to be let down. I'm not saying this card is bad. I just was getting excited about it as I was reading it. This card, one of the first novelty cubes that I designed was called a Squee Cube. The idea was it's a 360 cube because it has to be drafted with 8 people, and Squee is not in the cube. Squee Goblin Nabob. But there are 8 copies of Squee, and every drafter starts with a Squee in their pool. And that cube would probably love this. I mean, it was built under the assumption that everybody can discard things for value every turn at least once. And, cubes with graveyard themes, cycling themes can certainly play this as maybe a secondary Drakehaven.
So first of all, Justin despises this sentence, this ability triggers only once each turn. So you're doing a great job filling in. You're hitting all the notes that I'm sure you would. This card is, I feel, kind of tailor-made for my spooky cube.
Mm-hmm.
That was an environment where I actually really love the card Drakehaven, but I had a problem where the gameplay was super homogenized. Decks with Drakehaven just really tried to go all in on finding and then just turning everything into a Drake once they did find the Drakehaven. Whereas Dying to Serve kind of says, okay, here's a little bit of value. Don't go nuts. You can build a deck where this card is very good, but this card is not going to win the game on its own, which I actually do like that element of it. That can be kind of a really awkward thing when you explore the space of a custom cube where you think you have an archetype that's really cool, but you still want to have some balance around the different archetypes you think are very cool. And it happens a surprising number of times where you can have some really lopsided games in something that's not good enough for a classic cube, but ends up being way too good for your custom cube. And that cube does have Squee Goblin Nabob.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of this card, though I don't expect it to be in too many cubes otherwise. Zombies are also relevant. So
It's true.
Good for your Crypt Breaker decks.
Oh, very good for your Crypt Breaker decks. Although they enter tapped, right? Yeah. These 2/2s enter tapped, but still, I mean,
not
still good.
Busted, but good. Right. Next, we have Falkenrath Forbear. Not Forbearer, Forbear. This is 2 and a black for a 3/1 vampire with flying. Falkenrath Forbear can't block. Whenever Falkenrath Forbear deals combat damage to a player, you create a blood token. And for a black mana, you can sacrifice 2 blood tokens to return Falkenrath Forbear from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you probably need to be relevantly supporting blood tokens to really make this card turn heads. The body is okay. You know, your evasion is good. 3 power is good. Can't block. Not very good. Casting this card for 3 is not super exciting in a lot of environments. This most likely finds its home in a cube that is specifically kind of devoted to Innistrad, or really is leaning on the mechanics from this set and this block. I'd be pretty surprised to see this card in a cube without kind of a lot, many or even most of the blood token cards.
Yeah, one of the things that I tend to like, though, about cards like this, cards that they use a mechanic, they enable a mechanic, and while they're not good without respect to that mechanic, they're not complete garbage, right? A 3 mana 3/1 flyer, particularly in the kinds of formats that are going to play this, is a real card. Is it an exciting card? No, but it can still get your opponent dead. I enjoy this card, I guess is the best way to put it. I agree. I think generally this will find its home in a cube that's supporting blood, which has this sort of classic problem of it only exists in a single set, so there are only so many cards. So the cubes that will play it are going to be Innistrad type cubes trying to recreate this limited environment or something like that. I think this card with a few, it has a few different knobs that if they were tweaked just a little bit, could find its home in sort of more places. I mean, it is a creature. It's a well-statted creature that has some form of recursion built in with itself, some form of discard, and creating artifact permanence. Like, that is a recipe for success. But at the 3 mana 3/1 kind of slot, it's going to be hard to make it in cubes that are sort of pushing a little higher towards different power bands, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And you make a good point. It kind of starting itself on that blood token route is very cool. You probably have to have something that costs 2 or even 1 mana to really move the needle for this kind of card, though.
Yeah, like make it a 1 mana 1/1 flyer even, or something along the lines that like I can use it as an enabler. It can always chip away. It's like pretty likely I'll be able to bring it back. I could see it being really, really nice in that, the same kind of cube that maybe Blood Fountain is good in then, as it's a cheap card that is good at creating artifact bodies or setting you up for discard. Or make it a 2 mana 2/1 flyer. It's a little bit more aggressively statted. You can throw it in any aggressively slanted black deck. As is, it's going to need a bit more of a specific home. So our next card is Fel Stinger, which is 2 and a black for a zombie scorpion with Death Touch. Has Exploit. Exploit is a mechanic that says when this creature enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature. Then, something happens. In this case, when Fel Stinger exploits a creature, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life, and it is a 3/2. This is slowly becoming my favorite uncommon in Crimson Vow Limited. And the more I play with it, the more I see its applications in, I can't make a pauper cube, but in lower powered cubes that are trying to do interesting things with different, maybe sacrifice synergies. Exploit is one of my favorite mechanics of all time. Sidisi's Faithful is a card that was in my cube even the first time, and it's been in a bunch of different kinds of my lower powered cubes that I've built. It's in my current combat cube. I think something that a lot of that I find really interesting is I think any cube that is lower power and supporting ninjas really likes Sidisi's Faithful as an example, because it doesn't have defender. But anyways, that's an aside. I think any lower power cube with sacrifice synergies, this is a great value card to put in. And that's that.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot to like about this card. I think an important thing, I think some players are going to be hearing this for the first time, but it's kind of a reminder for people who did play during Dragons of Tarkir. Creatures can exploit themselves. So the floor for this card is 3 mana, sacrifice itself. Assuming your opponent doesn't kill it in response to the trigger, you sacrifice itself, draw 2 cards, and lose 2 life. And that's a fine return, certainly for a peasant cube. And then you have a 3/2 Death Touch body, so it can trade with anything. 3 power is also a lot if you have good attacks. Plenty of small creatures to sacrifice in the environments. Definitely if you have like a token theme kind of going on, which you tend to if you're trying to do some kind of sacrifice stuff. So yeah, I like this card a lot. And then our next card, also an exploit card. This card I'm going to call almost classic. It is custom, but there is a lot to like about Graph Reaver. 1 and a black for a 3/3 zombie warrior with exploit. And when Graph Reaver exploits a creature, destroy target planeswalker. And then if you do happen to keep on trucking with the Graph Reaver at the beginning of your upkeep, Graph Reaver deals 1 damage to you. So 2 mana 3/3 zombie warrior. Those are good types. Those are good stats. Losing 1 life, or rather taking 1 damage every upkeep, is problematic when you're in a damage race. So this card is really going to slot into cubes more when they are aggressive. I have cubed a decent amount with Cloistered Youth from original Innistrad that turns into a 3/3 that does 1 damage to you in your upkeep, and it bites you more often than I would like. Then the mode here, though, the 2 mana mode to just sacrifice itself and destroy a planeswalker, is what makes this card fairly remarkable. If you do have a cube that is supporting zombies and warriors, which I will grant is possible, then the body maybe gets there on its own. But mostly the selling point is kind of that modality where it's like, okay, well, I either have this creature that's pretty good, not great on turn 2, or I have the ability to cut down a planeswalker, which, after they've activated, that's also pretty good, not great. So you have 2 fine deals, is my endorsement of Graph Reaver.
Well, I mean, most modal cards, right? Lots of modal cards, their thing is 2 fine deals, right? Generally,
Exactly.
Like you think of Izzet Charm, which is a card that I love in Cube. It does 3 things and it does them all real bad, right? Like none of those cards are cards that would be even remotely close to ending up in my cube. But the fact that it does all 3 is really nice. I'm not a huge fan of Graph Reaver. Zombie and Warrior are really nice types. I really enjoy the card Najeela, the Blade Blossom, I think it is.
Yep.
And so, any Warrior I always have an eye on for that particular card. I think something that I've personally struggled with cubes all over in terms of design is, sort of point and click planeswalker interaction. I'm not a lot of the cards that say destroy target creature or planeswalker are almost too expensive, right? Like, I think Vraska's Contempt, Hero's Downfall, even Murderous Rider, they're good cards, but generally I don't want to be paying 3 or 4 mana for my interaction in cubes. So this takes that a little bit lower. And it's nice that it's a 3/3. I think I would have appreciated the card a lot more. Surprise, surprise, it's like a 1-mana 2/1. But any cube that wants to kind of keep its planeswalkers explicitly in check, which I know a lot of people really want to. Some people do that by limiting the number per color, or making sure that you have enough interaction, removing maybe one of the sweeter Rakdos gold cards to fit in Dreadbore is a thing that, it's a decision that you can make. And I view this kind of as a similar decision. If you support a black aggressive deck, and or you really like the card type zombie and warrior, and you're really trying to keep your planeswalkers in check a little bit more and add some more density of ways to get them off the board, this is a good card to look at. So our next card is Headlessrider, which is 2 and a black for another zombie. Whenever Headlessrider or another non-token zombie you control dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and it's a 3/1. So it's always nice to have sort of cards that churn your board into sack fodder for black decks, right? There are a lot of different cards that do this, more than I can list right now. I can remember, there's a 4-drop that's like a 4/3, and whenever your creatures die, they become Eldrazi Scions, I think. There's what's the classic one that makes humans called, Ryan?
Zithrid Necromancer.
Right. It makes it makes zombies,
but it's
when
zombies,
your humans die.
Checks humans, yeah.
Right. I really like those kinds of cards. They've been pushed out from classic cubes recently. I think you go back long enough, Zithrid Necromancer was in quite a few cubes. And now they end up being sort of synergy pieces here. If you have a zombies theme, a 3-mana 3/1 that dies into a zombie and makes the rest of your board potentially even die into zombies, I mean, that's quite good, particularly, again, if you have any sacrifice themes in black.
Yeah, for sure. If you have the Carrion Feeder and the Grave Crawler to go with it.
Ooh.
Yeah. There's some nice bones for zombie tribal and cube, as it were. This one is another straight to spooky cube card for me. My only qualm with the card is that it is called Headlessrider, but the art clearly depicts 5 heads.
Oh, that didn't bother me because I didn't notice it. Now it's going to bother me.
Yeah, part of my job on the podcast is to tell people things that are upsetting.
Lovely. I'm sure I'm going to enjoy that.
Right, our next card is Henrika Domnathy. This is 2 black for a 1/3 legendary vampire with flying. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one that hasn't been chosen. You can have each player sacrifice a creature. You can draw a card and lose a life, or you can transform Henrika into Henrika Infernal Seer, which is a 3/4 with flying, death touch, and lifelink. It also has an activated ability for 1 black. Each creature you control with flying, death touch, and or lifelink gets +1/+0 until end of turn. I kind of wish that was templated where it just checked all of them and this creature gave itself +3/+0, but whatever. As it stands, this is a cool creature, does a few different things. I like that it is a list of abilities that you can only do one time, but it doesn't specifically incentivize doing all of them and picking the order. If you are behind, you probably just have to transform this creature right away. Or if it's your only creature and you really need some kind of removal, then you sacrifice it right away. So you're not just sitting there like, okay, I got to do all of these because this is what the card says. Like, there's actually some tension here, and it's going to play a little bit differently from game to game, which I like a lot. The reason why this is going to be a custom card, well, for 4 mana, that's a lot of mana for a 1/3. 3 toughness is pretty vulnerable. There's a number of black cards gave you better return. Most loudly, this card's going to generally compare pretty unfavorably to Rankle, Master of Pranks, which just kind of does all this stuff, except it's a haste creature.
Yeah. The more I read this card, it's a cool card. I enjoy the abilities, the way it's set up. The play patterns are probably pretty interesting. I think it would have needed to kind of be pushed a little bit further to make me a little bit more interesting. Maybe the backside. I mean, you don't necessarily need to add another keyword, but if this could be a flying lifelink haste creature, right? That would be great. Or if you could choose the abilities multiple times, as is there are just a bunch of really good black 4s. I'm interested, like, what type of cube do you see this card having a nice home in?
Yeah, so I think it would have to be a cube with no rarity restriction and a sacrifice theme, where the other themes make a card like Rankle problematic, where if your opponent can just hit you and keep edicting you like with haste in every turn, you're never going to be able to claw your way out. But then this card giving the option once is good for that kind of deck, but not backbreaking.
I like that. I think that's something that I should just generally be thinking about more, particularly as I'm going away from, I have my classic cube, but designing plenty of other kinds of cubes. And something that I often don't think about is controlling the ceiling, really, of where I want different types of how I want different types of cards to perform, and understanding that it can be a really nice decision to choose a card like this over a card like Rankle to help get rid of the feel bads. People come together to cube and they want to have a good time, right? That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and also the vampire card type,
right? Of course,
likely is going to be a big factor in any cube that actually does play the card.
Our next card is Path of Peril, which is 1 black for a sorcery. It says destroy all creatures with mana value 2 or less, and it has cleave for 4 white-black, which would convert this into just a wrath, destroy all creatures. This is a card that was so close to me really looking at for my classic section. As is, it ends up being a little bit too narrow on one side, right, with the 2 or less, and then too expensive on the other side, which is where I really like it in terms of this custom category. I think in a lot of non-classic cubes, 4 mana wraths can be extremely oppressive. And so giving those kinds of cubes access to wraths is also important. Something that I personally don't enjoy myself when I've played cubes in which I know for a fact there's no wrath. I find that there's less tension in certain games. I never have to think, okay, I understand I can always extend to the board. And this is a great way of like putting like a safety valve, kind of like how there are different situations or cubes where you might want like an infest, a 1 black, every creature gets -2/-2 as a safety valve against tokens. But it's kind of unfortunate because, sometimes that card's going to be dead in other creature matchups that go a little bit bigger, or it's going to feel bad as a 3 mana sorcery. And so a card like Path of Peril that can play a very similar role of a safety valve against a certain kind of curve out and or strategy, while also introducing an expensive wrath to a lower power format, is something that I think is really appealing.
Mm-hmm. And this is something I've said about a number of recent designs, but this is a sweeper that does a great job at pushing back against go wide token themes, just cleans up tokens at a really nice price without just demolishing people for playing 3, 4, and 5 mana creatures. Like, there's already a ton of incentive to not play 4 and 5 mana creatures when you're talking about cards printed in the history of Magic. You were saying at the top of the show, you really got to push me to play that mid-range crap. And having a sweeper that doesn't just demoralize you for casting Baneslayer Angel, I think, is a really nice touch. Our next card is Persistent Specimen for 1 black mana. It's a 1/1 skeleton. For 2 and a black, you can return Persistent Specimen from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. There's kind of a long list of good 1 mana creatures for sacrifice themes at this point. So this is going to be your card that is good in a sacrifice deck, but in a lower powered cube. This is a common, so if you have a sacrifice theme and a popper cube, I bet there's still a good amount of space for a card like this.
Yeah, a lot of the cards that come back from the graveyard end up being at higher rarities. So I could imagine this being a nice fit for a pauper cube. It's kind of like my favorite type of card. So I enjoy playing with these. Whenever I draft a Pauper Cube or a lower power cube that has, I think it's Reassembling Skeleton. It's 1 and a black for a 1/1 with the same ability, but it's 2 mana instead of 3 mana. I just enjoy playing with those types of cards.
Yeah, they're real crowd pleasers. Like, this is just a nice card to play with because you could just keep doing the thing. It's very satisfying.
Yeah, and if you have an exploit theme, this is a nice way of tying that together. This is, and it does so in the current limited format. If you'd like to draft Dimir, I would recommend picking up a copy of this card. Our next card is Shadow Grange Archfiend, which is 6 and a black for a demon. When Shadow Grange Archfiend enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. You gain life equal to the greatest power among creatures sacrificed this way. And it has Madness for 2 and a black and pay 8 life. And it is an 8/4. I think this card is super cool. I'm a big fan of the, a player sacrifices a creature with the greatest power. I think it's a great way of getting around things like Hexproof Ward and other ways that you could sort of protect a threat, indestructible, in a way that edicts often fail, right? Because if there's any token lying around, then that'll stop the edict. So this is really a nice. I think the card's called Soul Shatter, which is something like that really overperformed when I saw it in cubes, because I was expecting it to be like, okay, sure, it's like an edict that hits planeswalkers, but like recently edicts haven't felt so good. But that card really felt great because so often it killed the thing that I wanted to kill. So I'm going to look at this a little bit more like a Necrotal that could be very exciting in any cube with a Madness theme or a discard theme. I mean, 8 life is a hefty cost, and you're not going to recuperate the whole 8 life from gaining the life equal to the creature that they sacrificed, but you'll recuperate some of it and then maybe even eat something else if you were able to do this in the middle of combat.
Mm-hmm. And real quick note, if you have not heard of this card, just so you know that this is in the Commander set. So if you were looking for this in the actual set list, that's why you weren't finding it. So we did not make up a card. But yeah, this card is really cool. The 8 life is such a difficult cost to evaluate. And obviously the card is designed with Commander in mind. I think that is just going to be a home run for people that actually curate a Commander cube. Kind of no matter what else is going on in there, there's going to be some kind of looting or rummaging effects where you can do the Madness, or just casting the card for 7 is totally reasonable. It's kind of tough. I don't think that this one's going to make its way into Spooky Cube, and maybe I'll pick up a copy and try it out, though I don't expect it to stay in there in perpetuity, just because 8 is such a big number. I'm almost intrigued to look at a cube that does Madness and Death Shadow, but that just sounds like kind of deranged, but also kind of exciting. So I'm conflicted. I
mean, if this could be a combat trick, like a +8/+8 combat trick, that makes me happy. I don't really care I don't care if it's good.
Yeah, you just got to get it off one time. That's it.
Yeah.
And we have one last card for black, and that's going to be Voldaren Bloodcaster. 1 and a black for a 2/1 vampire wizard with flying. Whenever a Voldaren Bloodcaster or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token. And whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more blood tokens, you transform into Bloodbat Summoner, which is a 3/3 flyer. And still a vampire wizard. At the beginning of combat in your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 bat token with flying and haste in addition to its other types. As a baseline, 2 mana 2/1 fire can block. Yeah, I have cubed with some 2 mana 2/1 flyers that can't do that. And then they didn't necessarily have additional text. And then making the blood tokens when you sacrifice creatures, the blood tokens themselves being discard outlets. So if you have some creatures that can come out of the graveyard, like a blood gas style of thing, there's a lot of things you can do to synergize with this card. And then the 3/3 on the backside is not overwhelming, but it is a really good return on 2 mana. And then waking up those blood tokens and getting busy with those, that's a pretty nice ability as well. A vampire, a wizard, those are two types that can matter. I think that you generally will know if you want to put this card in your cube, but also the rate is just so good that you're not going to miss by much, I imagine, if you put this card in a cube.
Yeah, I mean, I think this would have made my classic cube a few years ago. I'm not sure how long ago when it might have been with the printing of it's a recent card. It's like a 2-mana 3/1 with landfall that comes back.
Skyclave Shade.
Yeah, that one. I mean, recently we've gotten a lot of good black 2s. But a few years ago, I remember looking at just the 2-mana 2-power flyers or 2-power evasive creatures that I had in black, and this would have been the best of the bunch. So I'm also just a big fan of cards like that, where you can go, okay, this is a cool card to play. It does cool and interesting things that different decks will find use for. And you know what? The rate is good enough that it's never just like you cast this card. Have you ever just you're playing with a new Magic card, maybe you add it to your cube and you cast it and you just feel bad about casting it?
Yes.
Right. And a card like this it's not going to do that. And often sometimes you play with some of the newer cards and you think it's going to be really sweet, and you just you cast the card and it doesn't do the thing that you wanted it to, and that's fine, but it's also just such a bad rate for the cost that you paid that you feel bad. And this will never do that. So I think this is a really cool card. I also just really, really like blood tokens. As I've said a few times, discard outlets are something that I'm always looking for, and I'm always aware of okay, this is an artifact permanent. Certain cubes really care about that.
Yeah, for sure. This one I expect to make it into a good chunk of cubes again, because if you're wrong, it's not going to be by much. If this card underperforms, it's going to be next to probably just a quite good 2-drop, because this is in reality just a quite good 2-drop at its floor. And that is our last black card that we'll be discussing for Cube from Innistrad Crimson Vow, which means that we're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back to discuss red. What's up, gamers? Taking a break from the pod to talk to you about Star City Games Premium and why, if you're not already a member, you really should become one. First of all, the price is great. Only $7.99 a month. That's less than the price of one collector booster. And for that, you get all the following. You get a 5% discount on all Magic the Gathering sealed product, including the aforementioned collector booster, a 10% discount on all Magic the Gathering singles, if that's more your speed, and as well as a 15% discount on all supplies. It's going to be your deck boxes, your binders, your sleeves. Lord knows I always need more sleeves for cubes and all the Magic cards I have lying around. And you also get free entry into some SCG Tour online events. Definitely check those out. And finally, last but certainly not least, you get exclusive access to Star City Games website content from a stable of some of the game's greatest and most entertaining minds. You know who we are. You know where to find us. Sign up for SCG Premium today at starcitygames.com/join-premium. Welcome back to our cube review of Innistrad Crimson Vow. We just went over the black cards. Now we're moving on to red. For red, this is the lightest classic list that we have had so far. We have one card. And that card is Manaform Hellkite. This is a 4-mana, 4/4 flying dragon for 2 red. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX red dragon illusion creature token with flying and haste, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. Exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. And tracking the mana you spent is actually very significant here, because a lot of people's first thought might have been, oh, sick, I can sacrifice 2 mana and fire 2 mountains and fire blast my opponent and deal 10 because I get a 6/6 dragon. That's not going to work here. You get a 0/0 dragon token. And this is actually a bit of a discussion that Justin and I had about Moonveil Regent in Midnight Hunt, where this card is not going to be at the top of the list for 4-mana red cards in Cube. The reason that I kind of give it the classic designation over custom is it's a 4-mana 4/4 flyer. If I draft this card, I'm going to put it in my deck because that's a really good rate. And I'm sure there's going to be instants and sorceries in the cube, but there's instants and sorceries in every cube. So this card isn't doing anything special. It's just mostly attacking and probably winning the game pretty quickly. And there's a good chance it shows up in some or all of the Magic Online and Magic Arena cubes. I'm not looking for it over a card like Koth of the Hammer or Hellrider, but also I expect that it closes the game pretty quickly when it does show up.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting. The list of hard-hitting dragons at 4 is climbing and climbing and climbing. This card is, I mean, if I'm reading this as 4 mana, 4/4 flyer, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it deals 2 damage to the opponent, something like that. Now, this is probably, I don't know if this is better or worse. It's probably slightly worse because it's or a lot worse.
One of my favorite Magic phrases. It's strictly different from that.
Right, but to help me, because like when I first read this card, I first thought it was insane because I didn't think the tokens got exiled, and then I was like, kind of, my mind was blown. And then I read it with the tokens getting exiled, but I thought that I could do things with Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise to make big ones. And now, I'm just a little cool on it with respect to the other things at that option. It's a cool new card to play with, but there's so many other, 4 mana dragons, right? Like, let's say, what's the one? I'm so bad with card names. It was like when you target it with something, I think it deals 4, deals 3 to them. Something region, Thunderbreak region?
Thunderbreak region.
Right. Yeah. Like, where does a card like this line up against Thunderbreak region? It's more explosive, but it's, less of a pain maybe for an opponent that has a removal spell in their hand. So I think this is powerful. If I draft a red deck and it's in the cube, as you said, it'll make my deck some percentage of the time. And it's going to end up probably being too good for quite a few cubes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of this thing where it does highlight the imperfection of the classic versus custom category. It's like a classic minus.
Right. Like there are a lot of classic cubes that it's just not going to be good enough for, but also there are going to be plenty that can play it. And if you put it in your classic cube and I'm drafting your classic cube and drafting a red deck, there's a chance that I'm going to play with it and be happy that I'm playing with it.
Yep. All right. What is our first custom card?
All right. Our first custom card is Cemetery Gatekeeper, which is 1 red for a vampire with first strike. When Cemetery Gatekeeper enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. When a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player. It's a 2/1. So this is basically a 2-drop. I mean, I guess there's not always a land in the graveyard, right? But it reminds me of Zozu the Punisher, which is I think that was in my first iteration of my cube. I had Zozu the Punisher and I loved that card. One of my favorite red creatures, just period. And I also love Ankh of Mishra. So I enjoy those kinds of cards. And so for me, I'm really excited about this card. I'd be even tempted to say classic in the sense that it's a good red 2-drop for any cube that wants a good red 2-drop. At the same point, competition there. So I guess we're keeping it custom for that reason. But being able to punish not just lands, but other spells is pretty interesting. If you played this against, like, let's say a blue-red deck that has a bunch of cantrips and you hit instant, they could just lose, right? It could be, Eidolon of the Great Revel level of damage to them without it to you, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think that a lot of players are reading this card and they're having those kind of dreams of the ceiling for the card. And the ceiling is certainly very high. I think if you just have the fetch land in your red deck and you line that up, that's like the actual ideal case is on turn 2, you get the 2/1 first striking Ankh of Mishra. Like, that's gas.
Right.
The card that I haven't necessarily seen other people compare this card to that I think is actually incredibly apt is Direfleet Daredevil.
Mm-hmm.
That card also has an absurd ceiling. You can cast Ancestral Recall with it sometimes, but most often it is Youthful Knight. Like, you just gotta accept those bees, and that's not bad. Youthful Knight's going to make your red deck. It just kind of has been outmodded by a lot of the 2-drops we've seen in recent years. Robber the Rich and cards that are on similar power levels have kind of been coming out with some regularity. And Cemetery Gatekeeper, it's a card that I won't be shocked to see it in a cube. It'll probably make my deck if I'm in mono red aggro. That is kind of the thing, though, is there's more of those 2-drops creatures like Robber of the Rich that do just go into decks that aren't necessarily solely bent on being aggressive. Like they can generate some value outside of a body in combat or dealing damage. Where Cemetery Gatekeeper, I think I'm cooler on it than most people. And there's a really good chance that this card does just show up in some or all of the Magic Online cubes. I just think that its presence is more forgettable than some players might think.
I definitely, same page. One thing that I will say, particularly this cycle of, are they all called Gatekeepers?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's Cemetery. Cemetery is the name.
Okay.
So they're all, that makes sense because they exile from the graveyard. So this Cemetery cycle, one of the things that I really like about it, all particularly targeted at the custom category though, is one-shot graveyard hate. Something that I think is really interesting in terms of cube design and important to keep in mind for cubes with a very heavy graveyard theme is it's important not to shut down the graveyard, even though, like, let's say you have that cube and you have a card like the Black Leyline or any card that's just like your opponent's graveyard doesn't exist, right? That card is probably actually just extremely good in that cube, but you shouldn't put it necessarily in that cube because it just hoses anybody having fun. At the same point, being able to interact with the graveyard to some degree is probably important if it's a main part of the main resource in every single game. And so I'm a big fan of one-shot graveyard hate in that manner. You have a dynamic to introduce to the games that lead to sometimes interesting decisions in custom cubes with a serious graveyard theme. I think this Cemetery cycle is really, really good for that. And I could see this particular card being one of the best cards for red aggressively slanted decks in cubes like that.
Yeah, I really love that note. That's something that is pretty... I guess it's kind of a quiet element to the design, but it has been an element of the Spooky Cube design since its inception. Like, I really like Death Gorge Scavenger. That's one at a time graveyard hate, and I think that Scavenging Ooze is like oppressive and not fun. So that's a really good note for anybody working on a graveyard cube. Right, our next custom red card is Chandra Dressed to Kill. 1 red for a 3 loyalty Chandra Planeswalker. For +1, you add red. And Chandra Dressed to Kill deals 1 damage to up to 1 target player or planeswalker, not creatures. +1, exile a top card of your library. If it's red, you may cast it this turn. So it has to be red, can't be a land. -7, exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may cast red spells from among them this turn. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a red spell, this emblem deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast the spell. So that ability then, till end of turn, tracks the amount of mana you spent. So a lot of things played safe with this card. And I think it's a totally reasonable card to have in your cube if you maybe have kind of a monocolor slant, or you want a card that's kind of nice for maybe a mono red deck against a control deck, but isn't completely overwhelming. The card just does kind of suffer from the obvious check on the power level on all 3 abilities. Yeah,
it's certainly, powered down, but that can also be a really good thing, particularly on a planeswalker. Something that, I know, I think War of the Spark, some people, it kind of like opened the floodgates related to planeswalkers, but something that I really appreciated from it with respect to cubes is that it's a card type that produces value that is naturally interacted with creatures, right? Like being able to attack your opponent's card advantage source is a really interesting dynamic. The problem is that the planeswalkers have gotten so good at protecting themselves, generating this value, and so on and so forth, that it doesn't really play out that way. And so I appreciate planeswalkers like Chandra Dressed to Kill that is sort of like a lower powered cube, like a fairly lower powered cube, may really be able to enjoy having an extra dynamic in combat, because they can put this as a not broken card advantage source or even ramp source that creates an extra point of tension in the way that the game plays out.
Yeah, that's definitely a good note. And I like Planeswalkers, actually. Sometimes some players have very negative feeling about Planeswalkers. I really agree with the point you made about being able to attack card advantage sources being very compelling gameplay. And this card is really close. Like, I like a lot about it. It just doesn't fit any environment that I have worked on or am working on. And I work on a lot of cubes, so that makes me a little sad, because I would like a little bit more power, or a little bit focus in a different way where I would want to play this specific card. But hopefully somebody's getting some joy out of it. Right.
It's funny. This genre, I mean, it's a funny way to describe it, but I'll call it generically bad. Right? It doesn't do anything specific or well. It simply is a permanent that that has some options that are like all pretty bad for its cost. One of the things that's nice about that, though, is like, I guess the way that I would put it is, I think you could put this in a pauper cube and it could be really cool. Now, you wouldn't, because it's a mythic, but that's the kind of way that I see this card. If you take like one of the really, really low power, the ends of the power spectrum, and this is like a conditional red card advantage source, like repeatable red card advantage source, that's a ticking time bomb too, is something that like those cubes tend not to have many cards that can play that dynamically, because usually they're like way too good. And this is a bad version, so you could.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So our next custom red card is Creepy Puppeteer, which is 3 in a red for a human rogue with haste. Whenever Creepy Puppeteer attacks, if you attacked with exactly one other creature this combat, you may have that creature's base power and toughness become 4/3 until end of turn. And this creature is a 4/3. So it's kind of like, we've seen a few cards, I think they've been white, like a 3 mana when it attacks, it changes the base power of another creature. I mean, this can hit hard. It's classically going to be best paired with any creature with abilities. Today, I was drafting earlier. I had a red-white deck, and I played like a 2/3 with Lifelink on 3, and then this on 4, and it was very impressive. It doesn't stand next to, the best red 4-drops like Headlessrider, but in the vein that we've been talking before, with I think we talked about it a lot when we were talking about Rankle and Henrika. Sometimes, Headlessrider is just way too good. And so you can power that down quite a lot by saying, okay, here's a hasty 4-drop that packs a punch when you're attacking with other creatures.
Yeah, I think that this card is going to be a big deal for future Arena Cube speed runs.
Speed runs?
Keeping an eye. Yeah. I used to speed run the Arena Cube. That was a really fun thing to do. I think my best time was something like 40 minutes for a 7-win draft.
40 minutes for a 7? That doesn't include the draft portion, though?
It does include. Yeah, the draft splits were actually very stressful because sometimes people draft really slowly. So, but when the Arena Cube speed running competitions come back, keep this one in mind. Our next card, I like the flavor of this next card a lot. Curse of Hospitality. 2 in a red for an aura curse. Enchant player. Creatures attacking enchanted player have trample. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to enchanted player, that player exiles the top card of their library. Until end of turn, that creature's controller may play that card, and they may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast this spell. There's a number of cards that do this kind of thing. We see more and more cards just in Magic that in some way let your opponent cast spells from your deck or steal your stuff and play your cards, cast your cards with mana of any color. You're kind of paying a lot up front for that, and it checks on you dealing combat damage, which is something that tends to be happening when you're winning anyway. The spot where I like this card and cards like this a lot is actually in like a multiplayer cube kind of setting, because just like it's such a rude thing to enchant a player with. It is such a nice political card where you're like, I'm going to put this card's hospitality on you if you keep giving me a hard time. And I really like that dynamic a lot, where then people are incentivized to attack that player and also getting their grubby hands on their cards. So I like that quite a bit. And it certainly could find a home in maybe a token cube where the idea is that, I don't know, maybe you're not modifying the power of toughness on your tokens, or you don't use like a sacrifice theme and you try to have more creative ways to take advantage of them. Mostly, I like the FU for multiplayer Magic here.
Yeah, I think this is a good, it has a good home in multiplayer cubes. Probably not all of them, but it's certainly, as you said, a rude card to play. My particular issue with this card is I had to read it 4 or 5 times before I understood that it didn't do actually nothing. The fact that it like it references kind of both players in the same sentence in a way where I thought I was dealing damage to my opponent, and then I was exiling the top of their library, but they could cast it this turn. And it took a very long time before I realized that I could cast it.
Yeah. You got Eldrained a little bit.
You know, card tech, something that I love Magic. Magic is wonderful. It's a fantastic game. I've been playing it for a long time. It's given me a lot, and I appreciate it. There's so much text on cards now. There's so much text, and I will, especially with all the flip cards. It certainly is something that sometimes I wish it was just it got a little bit more simple, but that's neither here nor there. And you know what? The fact that it's not, and the fact that there is a lot of text, I'll say my cube has appreciated it, even though, you know, my reading comprehension hasn't.
Yeah, for the cards I like, it's great.
Right. So our next card is Dominating Vampire, which is 1 red for a vampire. When Dominating Vampire enters the battlefield, gain control of target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of vampires you control until the end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. So this is going to have a home in any cube that supports an aggressive vampires theme, but I actually think it'll go slightly past that. Something that I'm a big fan of in cube design is cards that give you small little pieces of direction to make other decisions. So for example, I have a custom cube of my own. It's a combat cube. The concept of this cube is, what if the only way to get card advantage was in the combat step? It's not limited by any sort of rarity, any sort of power level, but it's rather what happens to the dynamics of the game when there are no Mull Drifters and they're replaced with Ophidians. This cube, the curve skews really, really low, such that lots of decks, including even the mid-range decks, end up with 1-drops. Meaning that even without vampires, this Dominating Vampire may be able to steal a creature. You may be able to, you know, sacrifice it in, you know, because you're entering combat to gain some form of card advantage. It's a card that I'm thinking about putting there, and one of the things that I really love about that is it gets me looking at the card types for my other red creatures. Can I, you know, are there 2 red creatures that are pretty close in value, but one's a vampire and one's not? Then I can make that swap. I'm a big fan of that for particularly humans in Classic Cube. I love supporting humans. And part of that is about making small concessions to be able to by swapping cards for creature type. What do you think about this card, Ryan?
So actually, the thing I really like about this card, I like the note you made a lot about just a cube that is largely about creatures, things being really efficient, where you can grab, even if you get up a 1 mana creature, it can still be something of consequence. I'm generally looking at it more where vampires do matter on that front, though. What I love about this card, I'm not saying that the card is pushed, but I am saying that they didn't have to make it a 3 mana 3/3. Red creatures, you can just make them weaker. For limited, it would still show up sometimes. In a constructed vampire matters deck in certain formats, this could still show up if it were a 3 mana 2/2. The fact that it is a 3 mana 3/3 just makes it a more exciting game piece. And I like that they do just kind of turn these knobs a little on some of these rares that maybe we won't be talking about this card in a year. Maybe we'll forget that it even existed. which kind of demonstrates the fact that they can make it a 3/3, and I am glad that they did.
Yeah, it's I think, we talked about this a little bit during the black section with Voldaren Bloodcaster, right? But it's really, really nice when cards that you might want to play with and mess around with are, well statted for the mana that you pay for them. It leads to, I would say, good feels when you cast them, right? Like, even if they're not doing the thing that you really wanted them to do, you're not embarrassed to put the card on the stack.
Yep, absolutely. Our next card is Flame Blessed Bolt, a 1 red mana instant. Flame Blessed Bolt deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. I guess it's supposed to be Flame Blessed Bolt, but anyway. This is Magma Spray, except it can also hit planeswalkers. And on the note that you had about Cemetery Gatekeeper, this is a kind of effect that I really like in a Graveyard Matters cube, or a cube that just has sticky creatures like Gravecrawler and Bloodcast. This is an effect that can exile, but it's one shot, and it's good against cards that are very powerful. Like Bloodcast can do some messed up stuff, certainly over the course of a game that lasts a lot of turns. And so kind of having these cards that aren't busted, like you can't Windmill Slam Magma Spray. Like it'll make your deck probably more often than it doesn't, but it's not like oppressive. And it's just this nice little check on those creatures that can really be obnoxious otherwise. And I like that quite a bit. And then making it so it can hit planeswalkers, that's a nice touch too. Maybe you only have a couple planeswalkers in a cube that would feature these cards. Maybe you have more, but just adjusting that a little bit. And I often will harp on cards for not being able to target players. And I'm actually really fine with this one because it is for the purpose of a cube where you want to be targeting creatures anyway. And it can be a little obnoxious or a little boring to have just a proper burn deck in an environment like that.
So do you think this then, so let's say you have an environment like that and you're currently playing, right? So this is the third card like this. There's Magma Spray, Pillar of Flame, Flame Blessed Bolt. Now, right? Let's say you were to play 2 of those. Which would you exclude? I'm curious.
I personally, so I'm thinking of a specific environment. I'm thinking of Spooky Cube, and I would exclude Pillar of Flame because I think it really benefits the card to be an instant. And I also think that I don't care about the card being able to target a player for the reasons I said. It is slightly deflating to have 2 cards that are basically the same card, except one is a little bit better. That's something that I would be thinking about. And I might even just like do something extreme and cut Magma Spray and Pillar of Flame. And say, Flame Blessed Bolt's the only one I like now. Like I do things like that sometimes.
Got it.
Definitely number 1 is Flame Blessed Bolt.
Makes a lot of sense. All right, our next card is Ill-Tempered Loner, which is 2 red for a human werewolf. Whenever Ill-Tempered Loner is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. It has an activated ability for 1 and a red. Ill-Tempered Loner gets +2/+0 until the end of the turn. Has Daybound, and the flips. And it's a 3/3. So the flip side, so if it becomes night, which happens whenever a player does not cast a spell for that turn, it becomes Howlpack Avenger, which is a werewolf. It says whenever a permanent you control is dealt damage, Howlpack Avenger deals that much damage to any target. Has an activated ability, the same one for 1 and a red. Howlpack Avenger gets +2/+0 until the end of turn. It's a cool card. If you have any, werewolf theme, I'm sure adding more werewolves is always good. I actually really like the line of text that's whenever this deals damage, it deals that much damage to any target. It makes combat really interesting, where you have to sort of see where things could go. Some weird things can happen in combat where your opponent plays a combat trick on your creature because they want their creature to take more damage. Or I guess if you're playing this card, you could use a combat trick on your opponent's creature in order to deal more damage to the Ill-Tempered Loner. It has a lot of interesting play to it. And especially there are certain cards that you could maybe pair this with, like, what are they called? The deal 13 damage to every creature and deal 20 damage to every creature.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Big Blasphemous Act combo energy here. Yeah, I've played with this card a little bit, and I actually think that this is one of my favorite daybound cards because of the tension of transforming, because it can be a really steep cost to take your turn off of casting spells. And this card technically has a mana sink, except it trades with everything. So like +2/+0 any number of times, but then not attacking. That's not really anything. So you are paying a cost to try to transform the Howlpack Avenger, and you can get into trouble if your opponent just has 2 spells and transforms it right back. So I do think that it's a really fun game piece to navigate day and night around. It is really powerful on the backside, but not oppressively so. And I think that the cat and mouse game, the day and night game, is engaging enough. And I think this is a cool card to play in a lower powered cube. Definitely, like you said, if you care about werewolves or even humans.
Actually, that now that we were talking about the sort of flipping dynamics, I guess I don't know if you've covered this on the podcast before, and if you have, we can skip it. But what's your opinion on Daybound and the old werewolf mechanic, and them sort of ending up in the same place?
We did talk about it kind of as we were initially reviewing this set, but now that I've played with it a little bit more, I'll say that it felt initially like they really cleaned things up. And some of this might just be me being an old curmudgeon, but I have come to really wish that this was just old werewolf text.
And why?
I don't like the tracking in the game. I think the big moment for me was a daybound permanent being destroyed, day and night being tracked for several turns on Magic Arena, and then a card being cast on its night side. Like, surprise, here's a werewolf. Where in paper, what's happening in the overwhelming majorities of paper games.
It's coming on
day
the
and
front
night
side.
Hasn't been tracked for the last 7 turns. Yeah. Like, nobody has any idea. Nobody has a clue.
Yeah, I think it's I've had I think there's sort of 2 issues that I have with it. One is that one. So for paper, it's a pain. The other is that I've been conditioned from the original mechanic. And so I constantly find myself doing things like, oh, okay, I can, what is it? Like, if the original mechanics, if anybody casts a spell, is that correct?
Yep. Yeah. So it is different in that way.
Right.
Too.
So like there are different ways that you can sequence things, and then you end up getting punished, or you don't expect something to come in at night and it does. Regardless, I was just curious.
Yeah, there is something. It's kind of cool when you start playing things on the Nightfall side immediately, if you can navigate that, and maybe you have a cube that has a lot of daybound stuff in it. That has been kind of a deflating element of these cards for Constructed, where it feels like once you start winning, you just keep winning because you're not paying enough for your spells. Like you're getting a real discount because the backside is much more powerful. So you just like snowball your losses. So yeah, I'm going to say I'm like pretty firm in liking the old version better. I think it is kind of nice that like it only counts you casting spells. You have a little bit more agency. That part of the change I like. The rest of the day and night stuff, though, I haven't loved.
Right. And do you think it's confusing to end up in a situation where you have a cube that has both?
I do have a cube that has both, and it is confusing.
Okay.
Expect that to start coming up on the digital cubes as well. But anyway, our next card is Kessig, Flame Breather, 1 and a red for a 1/3 human shaman. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Kessig Flame Breather deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is kind of another version of a card that there's, I believe, 2. There might be more. I'm pretty sure there's only 2
it's like
very
an urchin.
similar cards in Pauper. Yeah, Flameblade Archer and Thermo Alchemist are both super similar commons. And is just like gives you another of that effect. This is a 1/3. Thermo Alchemist is a 0/3. So they actually block decently. They let you turn your ponders, your other cantrips, or even your burn spells, get some more damage out of them. So they can be really threatening while also blocking really well. So if you have a Pauper Cube, it's most likely going to be a Pauper Cube that plays this because the uncommon or rare, mythic rare cards that queue off of this sort of thing tend to be much better. Like, I think this card is pretty plainly weaker than Young Pyromancer.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing, just a fact. But having more of this in a Pauper Cube, I think is really helps define your red, certainly your Izzet decks.
Yeah, I mean, I preach redundancy pretty hard when it comes to supporting particular archetypes. And this is one of my favorite archetypes. So whenever I draft something like a Pauper Cube and see what's clearly a lower power card that is meant to seed an archetype like Kessig Flame Breather, I always have a smile on my face, and I don't usually take it the first time I see it, but I will take it if I wheel it and just do it and have fun. I'm sure it's nice for anybody to add that type of redundancy for, I would say, at least for me, is a fan favorite strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the payoff having the redundancy, that tends to be where I really like it. I think it can be a little bit unexciting to have a bunch of spells that just all read the same. But when it comes to permanence and you get to have a bunch of them and you're like, I'm going to cast this spell and I get 4 triggers. Like, that's really fun.
Yeah. It's the same here. I mean, I think maybe my favorite creature of all time is Kiln Fiend. Now that one kills a little quicker, but it also, you can't sit back on it. Something that I learned from the last limited format, Innistrad Midnight Hunt, was that the card was Festival Crasher, right? It's a 2-mana 1/3. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it gets +2/+0. Kind of like Kiln Fiend. It hits harder than the Flame Breather, but you can't necessarily sit back if it's dealing damage on spells you're attacking. The reason I bring it up is the 1/3 body mattered a lot. Unlike something like Kiln Fiend, I could have a controlling strategy that's tried to play these Festival Crashers as blockers as their main role that helped you turn the corner. And so I think redundancy even on that aspect, since now we're talking there's a 0/3 and 3 other 1/3s that have text kind of like this, that kind of redundancy means that you could end up with maybe a controlling Izzet deck in a lower powered cube that can consistently not fall behind an aggressive, 1-2-3 curve, because they're always going to be playing a 2-drop that blocks well. And I think that's really compelling.
For sure.
So our next card is Kessig Wolfrider, which has my favorite mana cost, a red. It's a human knight, has menace, has an activated ability for 2 and a red. You can tap it, exile 3 cards from your graveyard, and you create a 3/2 wolf creature token, and it is a 1/2. As I said, I love myself some 1-drops, and a 1-mana 1/2 with menace. It's not the best stats. You're not excited about it, but the menace means at least it'll peck in for the first few turns. Unfortunately, the exile 3 cards from your graveyard is a really large cost. You're activating that once, maybe twice. And, it's no Grim Lavamancer, right? Grim Lavamancer, the 1 mana is the real thing there, right? Like, you're happy to pay red to shock, for shock, right? And you're not really happy to pay 3 for a 3/2. That being said, wolf theme could get this going. Even graveyard theme, something that I always find interesting is when you're building a thematic cube, it's still important. Or just cubes in general, it is often important to have aggressive strategies to help sort of rein everybody in, right? People call mono red the fun police, but I think it's important that something like that exists, that you have to respect it, because then you are forced to build your deck in a way that is contained to, magic that gets played on the board right in front of you. And so in highly synergistic graveyard cubes, I still think it's important to support aggressive strategies, but it always feels bad when you're supporting an aggressive strategy and you're just playing cards that are off theme to have that aggressive strategy. And that's where I see cards like this shine. It's why I also love the card. It's Neonate, something Neonate. It's a 1-mana 1/1.
Insolent Neonate?
Insolent Neonate, exactly. It's like it pecks away, but it also does something that is thematic with a graveyard cube. So I enjoy red cards like that, and I think this could have a home there, especially because in a cube like that, there will be a lot more ways of getting cards into the graveyard to be able to activate this multiple times.
Yeah, makes sense. It's a human, which I like. This is not something that's necessarily resonant with me, but I think that the biggest part of this card, the most appealing part, is that it's a knight. Like a 1-mana red knight is actually probably a big deal. There's like a little bit of Knights Matter stuff in Magic, and you get a little bit more all the time. And Boros is definitely a place where it can be seeded, but you do need a lot of 1-drops. Like, it's certainly to make an aggressive deck work. Your stuff just has to cost 1. So I'm always happy when we get more 1-mana stuff with a creature type that matters or doesn't matter yet, but will matter. Our next card is Reckless Impulse, 1 and a red for a sorcery. Exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. So it's a, however you want to think about it, it's either a cheaper or a more expensive Light Up the Stage. I don't know, what are your glass half empty, glass half full? For me, it's a more expensive Light Up the Stage. And Light Up the Stage is also a card that I often won't start in my red decks and a lot of cubes, at least when it comes to 540 card cubes, so all of the digital offerings. It tends to be the case that I have a mana curve that is liable to having Light Up the Stage leave a card stranded. And that's not horrible, especially if you spend 1 mana and it replaces itself, but I wouldn't put that card in my deck. I'm putting it in my deck because the idea is I get 2 cards, especially because even at 1 mana, that's pretty cheap. But if I'm casting it, it often means that it's at the expense of casting something else in my hand, maybe activating the ability of a creature land. So the cost is not 0. It's cheap, but it's not free. I think that this card is probably going to largely be a Pauper Cube card. It can show up in non-rarity restricted cubes, but I imagine that a number of players will overvalue it. As somebody who has cast more Light Up the Stage, and I think most players, I both cast it quite a lot in Standard, and I played it extensively in Modern Prowess. Whenever I play a mirror, it's just so common my opponent makes a horrible play with Light Up the Stage. And it tends to be the case in my experience when I see people regularly misplay a card. It means that they are overvaluing it as a baseline, where you don't want to cast Light Up the Stage if you've already made your land drop. That's a recipe for leaving a land stranded, for not getting your full return on your card. And I think that the cost of having to play those cards in 2 turns puts a lot of pressure on your mana curve. It also has some variance associated with it that can kind of muck up the cards in your hand or the activated abilities that you already have access to in the battlefield. That I'm probably colder on this card than the average player, but very confident in my opinion of it.
So my opinion on this card is interesting because I was exactly where you were, in the sense that I'm not interested in playing this kind of card generally, right? I want my red decks to do, one of 2 things, right? Generally, almost no matter the cube, it's either going to be really aggressive or some kind of combo deck. And in a combo deck, I can be really worried about playing this early because to hit my land drops, because if I exile a combo piece, that can be a really big problem if now's not the right time. And in my aggressive decks, generally speaking, there are better things to do, right? Is this really my top end so that I don't run out? I never really want to be playing this on turn 2, but even turn 3 or turn 4, it's just a little awkward for the cost. Now, I'm up on it at the moment solely from playing it in limited. I expected this card to be a lot worse, and it's currently in my top 10 commons, and it's still going up. And I'm starting to take it very highly. Now, that doesn't mean it translates to cube at all, but it makes me keep an eye on this card as okay, is this kind of let's say I draft some, red black or red green or Jund mid-range deck. Do I just get a Night's Whisper that I could be happy about? Is that something that I should think about? Because with Light Up the Stage, at least, right? The 3 mana is so bad for the rate that you really can't afford to put that card in your deck unless you are confident that you are dealing combat damage to your opponent very reliably. And so after playing it in limited, on neither of the spectrums that I expect to see in my red decks in Cube as much, but more so on the mid-range front and being very, very happy with it at 2 mana. I'm wondering if it actually can play really nicely in any cube that is trying to support a red mid-range deck that often may struggle in terms of efficient card advantage.
I could see that. And I also definitely buy this card in retail booster draft. I will ask, what's the copy number? Reckless Impulse 3 rolls around. Like, what's the number of copies where you start saying, I don't think I want any more of this?
That's pretty high. I think at the moment I'd probably tell you 5.
Okay, that's a very strong endorsement of the card.
Like, I mean, part of that has to do with, I think the current texture of this limited format, which we don't need to get into, leads me to want to have as many ways to sort of churn through my library as possible and not, and have things to do with my mana. So, this format is particularly conducive to this card, but also that's the case for plenty of cubes, right? Something that that can happen, particularly in cube, is there's a lot of really powerful cards, and red is one of the colors that has, generally its way to beat the most powerful cards is to get under them. But sometimes you do end up with a red deck that is more mid-rangey, and it often fails in terms of card advantage and particularly in terms of card selection. The red decks will have card advantage on different axes, and a card like this to help find your out can also be great. I'm not going to say that this is classic cube or anything, but a lower powered cube in which you find red mid-range decks come together more often, and you'd like to give them something to help bolster them in terms of card advantage, while also having a playable for red aggro. You can put this in your red aggressive deck. It's not necessarily going to suck. I think it could have a great home in cubes like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd also put it in if you are trying to push a really lean, aggressive prowess deck in cube, because that deck does like playing light up the stage, even if some people need to play it better.
So our next card is a card I didn't know existed until today. It's called Cyan of Opulence, which is 2 and a red for a Vampire Noble. Whenever Cyan of Opulence or another non-token vampire you control dies, create a treasure token. Red. Sacrifice 2 artifacts, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So I have to admit, Ryan, I misread the card when I sent this to you earlier. I thought it was whenever it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token.
That is quite different.
Yes. When I originally read this card, I was like, okay, I can see custom cubes that really like artifacts, because this is, it's a 3-drop that comes with an artifact body that can be used to splash, and it has, a form of card advantage built into it. As is, I'm a lot less excited about it because it really needs to die to give you that treasure, but then it's not there for the card advantage aspect that it could even turn that treasure into.
Yeah, you would have to be doing a vampire thing / a specifically non-token vampire thing. I'm like okay with the card. It is cheap enough where I could see it being a meaningful part of some cube, but it's very specific, and it kind of makes sense that you thought it did something different. Yeah, this is another one from a Commander set, and in the Commander's decks from this set release are very tribally focused, and that this one is no exception there. And I've worked a little bit with vampires. I do think it's a tribe that has a lot of cool things going on. I really like Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. It's a little rocky to make artifacts really matter on top of them, though this set definitely adds a lot to that. I haven't really looked at it on paper, but blood tokens are what's going to put this card over, if anything does.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Our next card is Volatile Arsonist, 3 red for a 4/4 human werewolf with menace and haste. Whenever Volatile Arsonist attacks, it deals 1 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target player, and up to 1 target or up to 1 target planeswalker. It is daybound, and at nighttime it becomes Dire Strain Anarchist, a 5/5 werewolf with menace and haste. And then it does 2 damage to any or all of those 3 things instead on the backside. And this card you may refer to as a strictly different Glorybringer. I think it is generally quite a bit worse. Glorybringer, I would put in firmly in the classic camp. Volatile Arsonist tends to get in a space where your red aggressive decks pretty crowded on 5 mana options if you even want to play one. In the case of Vintage and Legacy Cube, I try to shy away with that. 1 is kind of my maximum. It's a little unfortunate if I had to play more than 1, I find in my experience. And this is going to be worse than a number of the options, certainly worse than like a Thundermaw Hellkite. It is still a creature that packs a wallop. It has haste. It can cut down blockers. Can help you in the attrition game against planeswalkers. Has some evasion. I think it being a human is going to be pretty significant if you're talking about it for cube inclusion, or it's going to be some environment that has some kind of restriction on cards being printed. Something like, I don't know. God, I don't even know what the suite looks like in Pioneer Cube. It might even be crowded out for that. And they have so many cards in Arena Cube now that I would believe this card in Arena Cube, but I would also believe that the space there is fairly limited. I'm probably going to put this in a cube with a human tribal theme, but that is the biggest endorsement that I can give it.
Yeah, I mean, I said it at the beginning. If something costs 5, it takes a lot for me to want to put it in my deck. I think, as you said, if there's a theme that goes with it, whether it's humans, whether it's werewolves, try it out. It certainly can do quite a bit. I keep reading Menace as flying because I just see 3 red, 4/4 haste. My brain says flying. There's
I
just
also
no...
see this like big dragging cape or whatever in the art. And I'm like, yeah, that thing's probably flying.
Right. Is that a cape?
I don't know what it is. I'm pretty convinced it's not a cape, or maybe it is, but then there's the wolf that's clearly on the ground. So
right.
I don't know what to believe.
Yeah. All right. So our last card is Voltaic Visionary, which is 1 and a red for a human wizard, with the ability where you can tap it and it deals 2 damage to you. Exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Activate this ability only as a sorcery. When you play a card exiled with Voltaic Visionary, transform Voltaic Visionary. And the Visionary is a 3/1 and transforms into Volt Charged Berserker, which is a human berserker that cannot block, and it is a 4/3. So I think 2 years ago, I would have put this in a bunch of different cubes that I had. 2 mana 3/1 is just good stats on a red creature. It helps you be aggressive. It's a form of card advantage. The fact that you can tap it to effectively draw a card and then even have a better attacker is awesome. It's a little unfortunate that you can, if you tap it and you get something that, let's say, you can't play, you just tapped your 2-drop, dealt 2 damage to you, and like it still doesn't transform, which I guess can be a good thing. So you can keep trying to draw a card off of it, but that's going to stack up pretty heavily. As is the 2-drop slot kind of across the board for red has started to get really, really good, even in, a peasant cube that could take this. Like I love Rimrock Knight in peasant cube as an awesome dynamic, like combat trick 2-drop. Now this can block, and I don't believe Rimrock Knight can, but overall it's a pretty cool card. I think seeding card advantage in red is an interesting and important thing to do to make sure that it doesn't, end up in top deck mode like it really can if you end up just throwing a bunch of red cards in a lower power kind of cube, since most of them will not provide any card advantage and the other colors really are going to be good at creating card advantage. So this can be a great purposeful inclusion for that reason. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I generally agree with those notes, and I think this is a really cool design. And it makes sense to me the way the card is balanced. The fact that you have to take 2 damage to try to get the card advantage on a red creature with these kind of stats, that makes some sense to me. The texture of actually playing with the card's a bit off-putting though, where if I have a 2-mana 3/1, probably want to be attacking. So technically, I have this ability that I can do if I don't want to be attacking. If I don't want to be attacking, that usually means my opponent controls creatures that they are going to attack me back with. Maybe they're just blockers, but often they will be attackers. And I don't really want to tap my blocker and take 2 damage if that's what's going on. So I have a troubled relationship with Voltaic Visionary. I want to like it, but I think I hate it.
Hate's a pretty strong word.
Yeah, this is a podcast. It's important to have hot takes.
Right.
Yeah, I like the card. It definitely, like you said, maybe a few years ago could have been a classic card, largely outmoded. And I don't know, if I'm facing that decision where my opponent has a 2/2 and I don't want to trade with it, but then I also don't want to activate my ability, that just sounds like a really sour experience to me. So it has good types. It's a human wizard. It stops being a wizard on the backside. That's whatever. So there's a non-zero chance that I end up cubing with the card. But again, it's going to be a love-hate relationship. But that's going to do it for red cards for red and black for this week in our Crimson Vow cube review here on the 540. I gotta say, red in this set did not deliver much in the way of new cards that are powerful in unique ways.
Yeah. I mean, there's some sort of like the same old, right? There's a lot of redundant pieces or something. I guess I actually shouldn't even say a lot of. There are some redundant pieces for different archetypes and extra pieces of removal, but nothing that really got me excited, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly some cards I will cube with, but I had my top 10 article for Crimson Vow up a week or two ago, and yeah, no red cards crack the top 10, which I usually have at least one card from every color in the spread there. So that one took me a little bit by surprise. I suppose eventually it was going to happen that something wasn't going to be represented. I was hopeful it'd be blue, because blue has been spoiled for forever. But blue actually got some really nice tools in this set. Anyway, that's going to do it for us this week. I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter, and my articles weekly on StarCityGames.com cover a lot of things. I won't say all things Cube, but many things Cube. This week, I believe my article will be about powered Tuberts playing with Mox and such in 180 card cube. So check that one out if you like high powered cubes and cubing with 1 to 3 friends. Ryan Saxe, where can we find you?
Hi, y'all. My name's Ryan. Like this other Ryan, of course. You can find me on Twitter at RCSax, and I also write articles for StarCityGames.com. Not about Cube, though, although occasionally you'll see me write about Cube. I write Tuesdays and Thursdays weekly about whatever the retail limited set is.
All right, definitely check out Ryan's other articles. Thank you so much again for joining us on short notice. We should have both of us Ryans back next week. We'll be talking about green cards and the rest from Innistrad Crimson Vow, and we will see you next week.